Is your life in China how you imagined it to be? Or asked differently, are you living the life you imagined in China? How do you feel about the people that surround you and the daily interactions that you have with your classmates, teachers, your partner, or your friends or family? Something that students in China don't often realize is the fact that the part they enjoy the most about their China experience is not just the learning Chinese language and culture part, but mostly the part in where you get to know the locals and people from all over the world and form bonds that will ultimately generate the most memorable moments of your life. But if you're like most people, things might not work the way you expected. Maybe things were not working out pretty well for you back home and you came to China seeking for a change. You were excited about the idea of living abroad, but after some months or years, you struggled to form meaningful and long-lasting relationships. Things you could easily have access to back home are not so easy to get anymore. You can't get through basic bureaucratic procedures without facing obstacles of some kind. You didn't come to China to spend the whole time in campus or in your room, but at the same time, it seems as if you can't go anywhere in the city without at least spending a few hundred yuan. And like I discussed before in episode number 4, Expectations in China, there's nothing wrong about having realistic expectations about things in general, but constantly idealizing people, places, or cultures can make your life a misery. How so? What exactly do I mean by idealizing? Today I'll talk about that and more, so keep listening if you want to know how idealization might be sabotaging your life in China. Welcome to China University. This is Chimsy, your student advisor. In this podcast, I will not only talk about the many professional, academic, and personal growth opportunities this country has to offer, but also I'll mention some of the major obstacles foreign students encounter while living in China. I'll share my experience, thoughts, and opinions along with some realistic advice and genuine encouragement. Anyway, welcome to today's episode, Idealizing in China. Let's start by defining idealization. What is idealization? According to Oxford's dictionary, idealization is the action of regarding or representing something as perfect or better than reality. The problem with idealizing people, places, or things is that it will inevitably lead to disappointment, and disappointment can lead to the opposite of idealization, which is devaluation. And devaluation is a way to cope with feelings of disappointment, and it's used when a person characterizes themselves, an object, or another person as completely flawed, worthless, or as having exaggerated negative qualities. If you want to know more about idealizing or devaluating, I'll leave a link in the description of this episode. Now, do you remember your China honeymoon? When everything was fresh and new, and all you could think of was about the places you wanted to visit and the things you wanted to do? Your first 6 months or first year in China felt amazing. You decided to extend your language studies, or apply for a master or doctoral program, or even apply for a full-time job in China. But after 1 or 2 years, you start experiencing your first disappointments. Things don't work out the way you want. You experience heartbreak or feel stuck in a major you don't feel passionate about, or feel stuck in a job you hate. So, how exactly do we idealize in China? The first thing is relationships and friendships. Relationships and friendships in China come and go. During the first year, you'll meet new people and inevitably you'll start hanging out with some people more often. But something that I've learned with time is that eventually friendships and relationships fade in China. And it doesn't mean you should not be making friends or dating in China, but you should at least have a clear idea that the relationship you have with friends, boyfriends, or girlfriends today might not exist next year or the next semester, and in some rare cases, even the next month. This could be due to friends meeting and making new friends, people graduating, people moving to another city or going back to their countries. I personally don't have any problem with that. Even though it is sad to see relationships and friendships on the decline, I treasure every single memory that I've had with the closest people in my life, and that's enough for me. But I know that for some people, it's hard to accept the ephemeral nature of friendships and other relationships in China. It doesn't mean that all the friendships and romantic relationships that you have in China are bound to fail. The reality is that many people that I have met have been able to build and maintain long-lasting friendships and romantic relationships while living in China. But usually, they require a certain amount of commitment, and circumstances will determine what path your friendship or relationship will take. For example, if you're dating a foreigner and you're both students, before one of you or both of you graduate, you'll have to decide whether one of you will move to the other partner's country, or if you will prolong your stay in China and try to make things work, or end the relationship. Obviously, no one starts a romantic relationship or friendship expecting it to end shortly after, but idealizing your relations with others and thinking that you two will be forever inseparable will most likely lead to disappointment, and constant disappointment might lead to you becoming a bitter and cynical person. And you might end up devaluing friends and partners and completely ignoring all the good moments you two had together. Another way students idealize things is by thinking that living and working in China is just like living and studying in China. But before I start talking about it, I'd like to tell you a joke. So the thing is that a man dies on earth and then goes to heaven. After several years in heaven, he gets bored and decides to go on vacations to see hell. So he packs his bags and goes on the trip. Upon arrival in hell, he's taken on a tour, and for his surprise, hell turned out to be the most amazing place he's ever seen. Not too hot, not too cold, just warm enough. Everyone in hell were good-looking, kind, and friendly party people. And at one point, even Satan himself stops by his hotel room just to say hello. When the guy goes back to heaven, he decides to move to hell because of how amazing everything seems to be down there. So he packs his bags again and books a one-way ticket to the 9th circle of hell. But as soon as he arrives, he's welcomed by scorching heat. He's stripped naked and thrown into a searing hot pit of lava. As he thinks, he noticed Satan walking by and yells out, "What the hell, Satan? Last time I was here, it was all fun and games. What happened?" Satan looks back at him and says, "Oh, God's little creature, don't mistake tourism for immigration." I mean, no way comparing China to hell, because just like the existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, by the way, that was perfect French, I believe that hell is other people, meaning that your idealization of China can actually make your life a living hell, especially if you think that by moving to China, all your problems are going to disappear. But I also think it's not fair for me to say that, because before moving to China, my first thought was not, "Oh man, I can't wait to deal with the so many problems I will face once I get to China." But you have to understand that by coming to China, you will have to deal with different kinds of problems. Problems that you probably didn't have to deal with back home, like finding foods and restaurants that suit your palate, finding clothes that fit you, being able to buy non-herbal medicines, or facing zero obstacles at the bank or while mailing packages abroad. Failing to embrace problems will most likely result in you becoming the so well-known angry foreigner that I have mentioned in previous episodes. Whenever I see an angry foreigner, I can't help it but to think about Jordan Peterson when he suggested that people who have suffered for prolonged periods of time tend to become malevolent. I know Peterson says many controversial things, but he's speaking sense here. Let me tell you this story about this girl I met during my first year in China. And I know that I always talk about my first year in China, but you gotta understand that during your first year in China is when you will meet and make the most connections with people and experience the most memorable moments of your life. People that know me would probably tell you that I'm a good listener. That's probably one of my biggest strengths, but also one of my biggest weaknesses. And I say one of my biggest weaknesses because I tend to attract the most talkative people out there. But it's also one of my biggest strengths because I often give people the chance to share the most amazing stories, and some of those stories mean a lot to me and end up teaching me big lessons. So for those who know me, next time you notice I've been listening to you for too long, know that I've probably already assigned your story to a future episode. But anyway, this woman that I met back in the day had been in China for 3 years by the time I met her. She came to China with a scholarship to learn Chinese, and she had an amazing time. She was hanging out not only with the local students, but also with foreigners from all over the world. She had plans for every single day of the week, and when she didn't, friends would reach out and include her in whatever plans they had. 3 months had passed ever since she came to China, and she decided to start dating one of her countrymates, which happened to come to China at the same time. Everything would turn out great for the following 12 months. Before they finished their language studies, they both landed full-time jobs at a local international school. And within a month, the guy, the boyfriend, decides to ditch her and start dating another foreign teacher at the same school. Geez, I guess none of these people ever heard of the phrase, "don't poop where you eat." By the way, sorry for being such a Ned Flanders when it comes to swearing in this podcast, but if I curse in one of my episodes, I would have to put in an explicit tag on it, meaning that some podcast platforms might restrict my content in certain countries. So yeah, after being ditched by her now ex-boyfriend, which she still had to see every day from Monday to Friday, she tried to get over it and tried to make friends with her co-workers. But the problem is that most of her co-workers were Chinese who were married with children and couldn't exactly hang out with a foreigner every single day. The rest of the foreign teachers were either married and had been working in China for years and had their own lives outside of work and were not particularly excited about making new friends. When she was dating, all she would do was to stay at home with her boyfriend and have picnics at a local park. But now that she was single, she had to get out of her apartment and interact with people. So she tried to go to bars and clubs close to her place, but most of these bars and clubs were Chinese bars and clubs. You know what I mean? Those places that whenever you step in, you feel as if you entered a bar in the Wild West because of all the stares you get. And listen, I have no problem with that because there's always an outgoing Chinese ready to start a conversation with you or have a drink with you on a dare or play some convoluted dice or card game. But anyway, even though she was willing to connect with the locals and had studied Mandarin for a year, she had troubles with having deep conversations in Chinese. And if you have studied Chinese for a year, you know that might not be enough time to develop a Mandarin proficiency that allows you to have adult-sounding conversations. I'm pretty sure that after a year of studying Mandarin, I was able to emit baby-like sounds that Chinese people would often interpret as intelligible Mandarin words. And after 7 years of studying Mandarin, I'm sure I still sound like a teenager for most Chinese people. So I kind of relate to this girl when she said that she felt as she wasn't being taken seriously when speaking in Mandarin with Chinese people. Not even when she was flirting with them in Mandarin. She said she couldn't even take herself seriously when talking about profound things in Mandarin, especially when every sentence she would say was interrupted by her vast collection of awkward filler words. So she decided to do other activities that would not involve going to bars or clubs, but then she started noticing how there was absolutely nothing else to do in where she lived other than walking around the park. That's when she realized that she was living in the middle of nowhere. She always thought it was weird that the school hired her on the spot after her first online interview. The school was in a big city, so she didn't think the location of the school would eventually become a problem for her. So after a while, she couldn't take it anymore, and she moved into a nice apartment close to the most centric part of town. But now she didn't have anyone to split the bills with, so she had to take 60% of her salary to cover most of her expenses without including food and entertainment. So in some months, she could barely save any money at all. Soon after, she found herself living in a big, nice, fully furnished, cozy, and solitary apartment. And she felt lonely. So she decided to move into a smaller apartment that she could share with other roommates. She somehow thought that she was going to become best friends with her roommates. But just like her co-workers at work, her roommates had their own life and didn't exactly want to hang out with people outside of their social circle. Even though she was, to a certain extent, aware of how unhappy she was with her life, the way she devalued every single person in her story, and how she only mentioned the negative aspects of her experience without mentioning any positive experience, makes me think that she probably idealized her life in China. This is a perfect example of someone who thought that their first year in China as a scholarship student was a good representation of what life in China was going to be like for the rest of the years. She probably never thought about how difficult it is to find a partner that is willing to stick to a committed relationship when living abroad. She probably never thought about how relatively easy it was to make friends in college compared to make friends outside of college. She probably never thought about the cost of living in a big city until after she had no one to split the bills with and had to give up 60% of her salary to live in a place she could call home. And as far as I know, she makes sure to tell everyone how negative her experience was in China. And I'm sure she genuinely suffered and experienced real emotions. But it's hard to believe that someone only had negative experiences in China. But I guess it's common for us humans to only focus on the negative events in our lives and to compare the present times with the good old times, which often happens to be me and the many foreigners who lived here in pre-COVID and post-COVID China. When I first came to China, I never imagined I would have to go through a global pandemic. I have to admit that I also idealized my life in China. I imagined that I would study in China and visit my family back home every year. I imagined I would graduate without any troubles and find a job that pays this legendary 20,000 yuan a month. Well, needless to say, none of these things I planned for the last 3 years have worked out the way I expected. And it's almost inevitable to become bitter about it and devalue all your experiences in China. You'll hear foreigners in China longing for the pre-COVID China, especially those students who left before the borders closed and came back when the borders opened for students. But I think some students didn't want to return to China, but they wanted to return to the life they had in China before. And I think that some of them were highly disappointed when they came back and noticed how different things were. During those 2 or 3 years, I think I've never felt more like a foreigner than when all the foreign students were gone and you had to sit alone in the canteen or coffee shop and get a million stares. But it's funny because if I would have had the same feeling 7 years ago when I first came to China, I think I would have not minded that much. Because no matter how many stares I would get in the street, I would always run into foreigners on my way back home, and that alone would add a great sense of normalcy to my life in China. But if you talk to the people who just came to China and have never been here before, they don't know any version of China other than the present one. And for my surprise, some of these people are just as excited and content to be here as I was when I first came to China. And I find that beautiful and revealing at the same time because it shows how your ideas and experiences are subjective and relative. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus once said, "Change is the only constant in life." Let me repeat that. Change is the only constant in life. And naturally, idealization doesn't mix well with change. Because ideas are thoughts, and thoughts are not facts. What's a fact, however, is that people can change, places can change, and China can change. Once you feel comfortable with change, you'll learn to negotiate with yourself when it comes to choosing what you want in your life, who you want in your life, when, where, and how you want it to happen. Without a doubt, optimism and pessimism will inevitably make you idealize and devalue. However, don't overlook the lessons that your own disappointment can teach you. Your measure of disappointment is often inversely proportional to the measure of your idealization. Alright, that's it for today. Next week, I will talk about the illusion of guanxi. Yes, the illusion of connections in China, especially among foreign students. Because adding random people on WeChat, attending every seminar or joining every school activity, club, or association out there won't necessarily help you increase your academic prospects or expand your professional network. You have just listened to China University Podcast. This was Chimsy, your student advisor. I'll see you next week.